It started with a wedding, not just any wedding, a moment that should have been the beginning of forever. The date was May 12th, a spring evening when two people stood before their families and promised their lives to each other. Margaret was 22 years old. She had waited for this moment her entire life. Her groom, Robert, was 26, a veteran home from the war, a man everyone called honorable, steady, trustworthy. But something was off from the very beginning, something nobody wanted to admit. Margaret wore white. Her hands trembled as Robert placed a ring on her finger, a ring so expensive that only a handful of people knew its true price. The ceremony was over in minutes. The families celebrated, music played, people danced, and nobody saw what was coming next. 8 days later, Margaret was dead. Pulled from the cold water of a remote river, her white wedding dress wrapped around her like a shroud. But the shock that shattered this family wasn't her death. It was something found during the investigation, something nobody had expected, something so unsettling that family members refused to speak about it for decades afterward. Before we get started, tell us in the comment where you're watching from. Canada, United States, United Kingdom, or anywhere you're watching from. We love to know how far our story has gone. If you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's uncover what really happened during those 8 days. Margaret grew up in Mimico, Ontario, in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were respectable. Her father worked hard. Her mother kept a clean home. Margaret had siblings who loved her, and she had a job at a local bank where everyone said she was capable and kind. She wasn't the type to cause trouble. She was the type to follow rules, to do what was expected, to marry the right man and build the right life. And then she met Robert. They had known each other for 3 years before he asked her to marry him. 3 years of dating, of planning a future, of believing that this was their destiny. Robert was handsome in that quiet, confident way that made young women feel safe. He had fought in the war and come home. He had a job. He had dreams. He seemed perfect. But Margaret's family noticed something almost immediately. They couldn't quite name it, but it was there. Robert was never quite alone with Margaret. His best friend, a man named Ronald, was always present. Ronald was a professional ballroom dancer, an immigrant with dark, intense eyes, and an accent that made him seem exotic and mysterious. He was beautiful in a way that made people stare. And he was always there, at every date, at every gathering. During the engagement, Ronald was present. On the wedding day, Ronald stood beside Robert as best man. And when the newlyweds left for their honeymoon, who went with them? Ronald. For the entire honeymoon, this triangle of 3 people moved through Toronto together, staying in apartments, going out to dinners, with Margaret watching her new husband and his best friend, as if trying to understand something she couldn't quite see. Margaret started to change during those first few days of marriage. Her sister Helen noticed it first. Margaret would go into crying fits for no reason anyone could explain. She would stare out windows as if watching for something to arrive or something to escape. She seemed distant, as if part of her had already left the room. Her hands shook when she held her coffee. She ate very little. She smiled only when Ronald was looking at her, and even then her smile didn't reach her eyes. Something was happening inside Margaret, something dark and confusing that nobody could put into words. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something deeper. It was desperation. Before we continue, stop and think about this. What would you do if you discovered your new husband had a secret so profound that it seemed to erase your entire identity? How would you feel? How would you react? Keep those questions in mind as we move forward, because Margaret was about to face exactly that. Margaret had written letters, 2 of them. They were discovered much later, after everything fell apart, hidden in places nobody thought to look at first. The first letter was written before the wedding, on Easter Sunday, about 5 weeks before she married Robert. It was addressed to Ronald. In that letter, Margaret confessed something that shocked the investigators who found it. She wrote that she had tried to poison herself. She was desperate. She was afraid. She couldn't bear the uncertainty of whether Robert would ever truly love her, whether he would ever really choose her completely. She wrote that if she couldn't have Robert all to herself, then she didn't want to live at all. She wrote that ending her life seemed like the only way out, but she was found. She survived. She explained it away. She said she was just being emotional, just having a moment of weakness. Nobody took it seriously. Nobody asked her to talk to anyone. Nobody stepped in to help her understand what was really happening. The second letter came later, written at the end of April, just days before the wedding. This one was darker, heavier with desperation. In this letter, Margaret wrote again to Ronald, and she said something that haunted everyone who read it afterward. She wrote that she truly loved Robert, that she would do anything for him, that she could not imagine a life without him. But then she wrote something else. She wrote that if she couldn't have Robert, then she would make sure nobody else could either. She wrote that she had considered not just her own death, but his as well. She was describing murder and suicide in the same breath, wrapped in the language of a woman so consumed by love that it had become poison in her veins. Again, nobody seemed to understand what was happening. Again, nothing was done. The letters were written to Ronald, only Ronald, not to Robert, not to her family, to Ronald. And that detail would become crucial later because Ronald knew about the letters. He had read them. He had received them. He knew exactly how desperate Margaret had become, and he never told Robert. He never told Margaret's family. He kept the knowledge to himself while he watched Margaret smile and plan her wedding and sign her name to register after register, preparing for a life that was already beginning to crack underneath her. On May 17th, the three of them, Margaret, Robert, and Ronald, traveled to a remote cottage that belonged to Ronald. It was a beautiful place on the water, accessible only by boat, surrounded by forests so thick that the outside world seemed to disappear completely. It was meant to be romantic. It was meant to be Margaret's dream honeymoon. Instead, it became a nightmare that nobody fully understood until it was far too late. During those 3 days at the cottage, Margaret continued to unravel. She would disappear into rooms and reappear with red eyes. She would ask Ronald questions when she thought Robert wasn't listening. She would sit on the porch and stare at the water for hours without moving. One conversation, overheard by someone, and later recounted to investigators, involved Margaret asking Ronald directly whether Robert truly loved her. Ronald's response was apparently non-committal, careful, neutral. He neither confirmed nor denied it. He left her hanging in that terrible space between hope and despair. Ronald spent enormous amounts of time alone with Margaret during those 3 days. They talked for hours. Margaret seemed to trust him in a way she didn't trust her own husband. Robert appeared oblivious or unconcerned about this arrangement. Or perhaps he wasn't oblivious at all. Perhaps this was exactly what he wanted. Perhaps the entire situation had been carefully constructed this way from the beginning. On May 20th, a fire started in the cottage. It started suddenly without warning, and it spread quickly. In the chaos and confusion of the fire, Margaret disappeared. She ran from the building, terrified, disoriented, possibly trying to escape something far worse than the flames. Robert and Ronald made it out. They survived. They stood and watched the cottage burn, but Margaret never emerged. Her body was found the next day, 150 feet from the cottage, in the river. She was in just 9 inches of water, but that was enough. She was dead. Her white wedding dress, the same one she had worn 8 days earlier when she made her vows, was wrapped around her like a burial shroud. Now ask yourself this: was it an accident? Did Margaret run from the fire, become disoriented, and accidentally fall into the water? Did panic overtake her judgment? Or was something else happening? What would you do if you were Margaret? How would you have reacted? What would have made you run into the darkness toward the river? The police arrived. The investigation began. Interviews were conducted. Questions were asked. But the answers that came back were confusing and contradictory, and nobody seemed willing to push too hard for clarity. Robert's statement to the police was strange. He claimed that he and Ronald had been in an intimate relationship for some time. When pressed, he elaborated. He said they were lovers. He said this had been going on for years. He said this was a fact that Margaret knew about, or should have known about, or might have suspected. But then, when Robert was called to testify in court, he changed his story. He said the police had coerced him into making that confession. He said they had pressured him into admitting something that wasn't true. He said he was innocent. Ronald said very little. He was careful, measured, controlled in everything he said to authorities. He provided accounts of the fire, of the events at the cottage, of Margaret's behavior. His statements seemed rehearsed, as if he had practiced them many times. Nobody could prove he was lying, but something about his testimony felt off. Something about the way he described events seemed designed to place emphasis on Margaret's emotional instability, her erratic behavior, her desperation, as if he was carefully building a picture of a woman on the edge of sanity. If you're still watching, drop a comment with "I'm still here," so we know who's writing this case out with us. Other details emerged during the investigation that created more confusion. Robert had given Ronald his war gratuity, a payment that every Canadian soldier received when they were discharged from military service. This was a significant sum of money. Why would Robert give this to Ronald? What obligation did he feel? What was Ronald to him that warranted such generosity? And then there was the matter of Robert's will. He had changed it. He had removed all members of his family from the will. All of them. His parents, his siblings, everyone. Nobody could explain why he had done this, and Robert refused to answer when asked. And then there was the ring, the wedding ring that Robert had placed on Margaret's finger. Nobody could find it after her death. It was gone. Some people said it had never been recovered. Some people said Ronald had purchased it. Some people said Robert had borrowed it from a friend. The price was disputed. Some said it was worth $1,000. Some said it was worth $13,000. But everyone agreed on one thing. The ring had disappeared, and its disappearance mattered, though nobody could quite explain why. The official cause of Margaret's death was recorded as accidental drowning. She had run from the fire, they said. She had become disoriented in the darkness, they said. She had slipped and fallen into the water, they said. Case closed. But the case never really closed, not in the minds of the people who knew Margaret, not in the hearts of her family members who lived the rest of their lives wondering if they could have saved her. The letters came to light during the inquest, and they changed how people understood Margaret's final days. Here was a young woman who had written about ending her own life. Here was a woman who had written about murder and suicide in the same breath. Here was a woman who was clearly in psychological crisis in the days and hours before her death. But here also was a woman whose desperation seemed directed at one person, Ronald. Her letters were to him, her questions were for him, her hopes and fears were entrusted to him. The inquest concluded that Margaret had died accidentally. No charges were filed, no arrests were made. Ronald went back to being a professional dancer. Robert never remarried, and Margaret's family spent decades wondering what really happened during those 8 days between the wedding and the funeral. They wondered if Margaret had killed herself deliberately, running into the river to escape a life she couldn't bear. They wondered if Robert and Ronald had conspired somehow, though they could never prove it. They wondered if Margaret's desperate emotional state had been manipulated by people who knew exactly what they were doing. They wondered about the ring, the will, the letters, the intimate relationship that Robert denied and then admitted to and then denied again. They wondered about so many things, but they never got clear answers. What would you have done differently in Margaret's position? What would you have seen that everyone else missed? How would you have protected yourself from people who seem to have their own secrets, their own agendas, their own reasons for wanting you to be confused and afraid? Can you imagine discovering that the man you married had a completely different life than the one he showed you? Can you imagine feeling so desperate that dying seemed like the only escape? Can you imagine being only 22 years old and running toward a dark river because staying alive felt more terrifying than what the water might take from you? This is the story of Margaret, an 8-day bride, a young woman who loved too hard and trusted too blindly and walked into a darkness that nobody could pull her back from. We will never know with complete certainty what happened during those final hours at that cottage. We will never know if Margaret ran into that river because she was desperate to escape, or if something more sinister occurred. We will never know if Ronald was simply an observer of a tragedy or if he played a more active role. We will never know if Robert's tears at her funeral were genuine grief or performance. But what we do know is this. Margaret's story is a reminder that sometimes the people we love carry secrets so profound that they can destroy us if we're not careful. Her story is a reminder that love without honesty is not love at all. Her story is a reminder that we should listen when people cry out, when they write desperate letters, when they show us their pain. If you've been moved by Margaret's story, if you've found yourself thinking about the choices people make and the consequences that follow, then please comment below and tell us what you think happened. Do you believe her death was an accident? Do you think Margaret deliberately ran into the river? Do you think someone else played a role in her death? We want to hear from you. We want to understand how this story has affected you, how it makes you feel about the relationships in your own life, how it challenges you to question the people around you and the secrets they might be keeping. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the mysteries that shape people's lives, the tragedies that remain unsolved, and the stories that deserve to be told and remembered. Thank you for spending these 30 minutes with us, walking through the darkness with Margaret, trying to understand a life that ended far too soon.